Welcome back to our series on ethnographic techniques for marketing research. I'm going to start off by just showing you this picture here now. I don't know anything about this picture. I pulled it off of a free images website. But I just want you to look at it for a moment and think about what you're seeing here. So we're seeing a gentleman who appears to be fishing. He's sitting on a really rickety dock among some branches that look like they've kind of accumulated around it. Doesn't really look like a safe or a particularly alluring place to be fishing, but he seems like he's all right. He doesn't seem like he's bothered or encumbered by any of this. The thing about this picture is we can only make limited inferences from it. We don't know anything about this gentleman. We don't know anything about what language he speaks, what culture he lives in, why he's fishing, whether this is recreational or vocational. We don't really know what the context of that dock is, what lies around it. We don't know anything about any of the people that are in his life or anything about his lifestyle. And so our ability to observe from this picture is very limited. But if we were to use a technique such as ethnography, we would be able to be sitting there right beside him, observing him, asking him questions, trying to understand the context of everything that's going on here, and most importantly, we'd also be able to ask other people around him why he's doing the things he does. Does he do this often? Is this something that he enjoys? Is it something that defines his life? Is it something that really tells us something meaningful about who he is? Or is this just something he's doing on a lark? So your role as an ethnographer when you're conducting an ethnographic study is to insert yourself into someone's life and pay attention to the little details. And ideally, the more of those details that you can elicit through your research, the better. The better a deep individual understanding you have of your research subject, the more complete your ethnography is. The goal of ethnography is to find what's obvious to your research subjects, but novel or insightful to everyone else. So going back to our fisherman for just a moment, many of the things that he's doing are probably a part of his life, and they're things that make sense to him. But they don't make any sense to the rest of us. They might seem bewildering or strange. And if we're not fishermen, they might even seem a little bit confusing or off-putting because we just don't understand any of the context behind what he's doing. It may be that that place that he's fishing, while it doesn't look like much, yields some tremendously great fishing experiences for him. It may be a place that he finds personal peace. It may be a place that relates to his childhood or to his upbringing in some way that is meaningful and which carries an enormous context for him. It's obvious to him. It makes sense to him. But to everyone else, it's something that's useful or interesting to understand a little bit more about who he is. In our workshop, we'll watch a lecture from an ethnographer named Ellen Isaacs. And Ellen Isaacs gave a TEDx talk about Broadway in New York, where she was talking about how ethnography is really about finding the hidden obvious. And I think that's a good way to really think about what ethnography is about, the hidden obvious, looking for things that when you know that they're there are extremely obvious, but when you don't know that they're there are just shrouded in mystery because of all these other things around them that make them not immediately jump out at us. So when we're conducting an ethnography, we first need to fall back on many of the key points that we were looking at in observational research, because a big chunk of ethnography is observing. So we had talked in our observational lectures about how we want to look at things like the appearance of a research subject, their verbal behavior or interactions, their physical behavior, their gestures, their personal space, any human traffic around them or how they respond to human traffic, and people who stand out. And this is when you're looking at an ethnography at a research subject, this is particularly interesting because you'll get a sense of how your subjects try to stand out in a way that you might not have gotten from just pure observational research. And in fact, it's really interesting how people often are very deliberate about choices they make that seem like they're very benign. For example, I almost always am wearing the color blue. This shirt that I'm wearing right now has blue stripes on it. I like the color blue. In fact, I've even got some glasses that are blue. I wanted to make sure that they match my shirts, and the case for my phone has blue on it. I really like the color blue. I don't know why. I just do. It's a calming, cool color that I think looks nice on my skin tone and matches my eyes and goes well with my hair. So I'm very deliberate about choosing the color blue. I'm not necessarily trying to stand out in the way that I'm dressing, but what I am trying to make is a statement that I like this color and that I think that it's something that I should wear. That little amount of thought that goes into what I wear has a huge impact on how other people see me. And it's not that I am necessarily in love with the idea of being associated with the color blue. It just happens to be a color that I want to wear. And so trying to get to the bottom of what that means to me, what that means to others around me, how they see me, if they go, man, I wish Sean would wear green or red or purple a little bit more often and vary up his wardrobe. That can be huge for understanding a lot more about who I am. Why do I resist the urge to wear other colors? Why do I tend to want to stay within the same kinds of appearance when I'm around other people that I might not necessarily stick to when I'm at home? Because when I'm at home, I often wear other colors. Thinking about some of those details can be really important. So people who stand out can take on an entirely different meaning in an ethnography. Some other things that you might pay attention to. Often when you're conducting an ethnography, you have a chance to view people in their natural setting. We talked about naturalism in the previous lecture. So their residence, their home, their furniture, their artwork on walls, their lighting, the condition of their home, the messiness, the cleanliness, and so forth. All of these things provide cues to a person's lifestyles or priorities. For example, someone that has dirty dishes in their sink, there's a lot you can learn from that. They might not be very clean. They just might be pressed for time. They might have just recently had a big gathering and they're still cleaning up from it. They might have a roommate who's not very clean, who is driving them crazy, but they've decided to fight a war with their roommate to see who's going to have to wash the dishes first. There are all kinds of things that you can learn from that. You can't just learn it from observation. You do need to ask some questions. But you can observe details and you can ask about them in an ethnographic study and get a real sense of what it is that your research subject thinks or feels about these cues that you've picked up. You can also pay attention to the transportation that they use, the habits they have for transportation, their focus on modality, and so forth. So someone, for example, that owns a car but frequently rides their bike, that is a really interesting ethnographic detail and something that you can really try to learn more about. Is it because they're trying to save money? Is it because they're worried about the environment? Is it because they're worried about health? Is it because they just like to ride their bike short distances, or because they feel that riding their bike makes their commute more bearable? Those are all really interesting details, and they're not things that would normally come up in an in-depth interview unless you were specifically talking about cycling, but they're things that might be really reflective of a deeper understanding of that person's lifestyle. I think it's also interesting to find out how often they rely on other transportation that they don't own, like if they use Uber or taxi services, or if they rely on friends for rides, or if they tend to walk a lot of places and take public transit. Those are all things that can be very interesting and reflective about who a person is. Their social groups are also important. Their friends, their family, their spouse, their significant other, children, classmates, colleagues, acquaintances. These are all different social groups that are in their cohorts that you can talk to about different aspects of who they are. And I think one of the most interesting things in ethnography, if you have a chance to really follow someone around and get to know them as a person, is to look at what personas that they use around varied social contexts. So when they're around their friends, do they take on a different persona than they do around their family? A lot of people are much more fun and exciting and on when they're around their friends and trying to have a good time than they are around family who know them and who put up with them a lot. They might be grumpy and mean around their family in a way that they're not around their friends, and it's almost like watching two different people. Well, getting to the bottom of what that means and why they behave that way could be important. It could be that they just feel a need to perform when they're around their friends that they don't feel around their family. And this can be really explanatory as well if the context in which they're around their friends has to do with some of these other things that we're going to talk about, work life and hobbies. So Work life, how your subject behaves in the context of work or related contexts like school or a job search or something like that. There are all kinds of things that shape behavior in work life. Organization, hierarchy, time management, stress, just general social dynamics, how well they get along with people, how well they're engaged by their job, how tired they are or how fresh they feel, how qualified they feel or unqualified for the work that they're doing. There's all kinds of things that can really affect their work life. And again, you can pick up observational cues and then ask them questions about what you observe. If you see someone that is constantly struggling to make it to meetings on time, if they seem like they're constantly sending out emails where they're apologizing, if their desks are a complete mess, those are usually signs that they're not having a real easy time with the job that they have. If, on the other hand, they seem to spend a lot of their time just waiting around for things to happen, and they don't ever really seem to be taking any initiative, that could be an important cue about the fact that maybe they're not engaged by their job and they're just kind of there for the paycheck. Or maybe they don't feel challenged. Maybe they need some kind of stimulation that they're not getting. So all of these things are cues that you can pick up on. And while that might not sound very important in a marketing research context, it could be in a context where you're trying to maximize worker productivity or where you're trying to study worker engagement or things like that. It could also be in a context where you're trying to find a product or service that'll make their life easier, and you need to figure out how to help them maximize the best use of their time. Now, hobbies and interests is a particularly popular topic for ethnographic research because it's often where people take on kind of a second life, and I don't mean second life like the computer game. I mean just like they behave differently. And again, a couple of the articles that I referenced in the earlier lecture that you can read this week, one about Harley-Davidson culture and one about Burning Man, those would both be in this realm of hobbies or interests. So what aspects of your life is your subject is most interested in, and what drives him or her to stay focused upon them? Most of us have something that we are really passionate about that has nothing to do with work, life, family, or any of our daily responsibilities. For me, my personal interest has always been video games. So I love video games, and I could talk about them all day, and I have lots of strong opinions on them. I spend probably way more time than I should reading up on them, and actually not as much time playing them as you would think, because I don't actually have time to play them, but not anymore anyway. But the point being that if you get me to open up talking about those, I can relate them to so many aspects of life that I might not be able to relate other things to. I don't really care about sports. I don't really care about a lot of music or things like that, but I do have a deep love for video games. Another thing that I'm very passionate about are good serialized television shows, like things that you would find on HBO or Netflix. I can talk about those a lot longer than I could talk about just formulaic comedies or reality shows or things like that. But that's me. Other people will be able to talk about those things in different ways. Some of the things that you might pay attention to would include purchase behavior, ownership. So what do they tend to buy? What do they tend to own? What do they just tend to use? Costuming, which is how they tend to dress. So this, like in the Harley-Davidson context, for example, there's a unique costuming aspect that goes on to Harley culture. And even people who are middle class by day and working fairly boring jobs, when they go out to Harley rallies and gatherings, they will put on a costume so that they can fit in with that culture. Life balance. Sometimes people get overwhelmed by their hobbies and they're so focused on their hobbies that it really intrudes on their life balance. Other times they barely pay any attention to their hobbies, and other aspects of their life are really out of whack, and that makes them unhappy, or that makes them behave differently. So that's worth paying attention to. Distinct expertise. Sometimes people have amazing levels of expertise about hobbies that they don't about any other area of their life, and I find this is especially true with things like sports. People who can't remember any kind of statistics or meaningful data about anything can tell you all kinds of statistics and meaningful data about sports personalities that they follow. Tribal membership. So I'm using this term because it's used in sociology a lot. I'm not actually really fond of it, but the idea that many people will kind of cling to and identify with what they consider to be their tribe. They'll find people who are like them, and they'll tend to want to assimilate into that group and be like that. So that's what tribal membership is. Emotional reaction, how they tend to respond when they're presented with their hobbies or interests. My 5-year-old daughter right now, when I present her with something that she's really interested in, she screams and gets really excited and jumps up and down. That's an emotional reaction. And sometimes you see grown people behaving that way to things that they get really excited about. Looking at hierarchies within the hobby. Sometimes it's pretty amazing the hierarchies that form among things that should be pretty simple. I had a friend that was really into World of Warcraft, and this friend would give up his Friday and Saturday nights to go and play World of Warcraft because he had a hierarchy of people telling him that he had to be there to help out with their raids that they were doing in the game. And to me, that seemed really strange. Like, why are you letting people in a game that you don't even know these people other than through the game? Why are you letting them tell you how to live your life? But to him, that was very important because it was part of the culture of his hobby. So there are lots of things that you can pay attention to ethnographically. Now, a few practical tips. And I want you to know, by the way, in talking about ethnography, I am going an inch deep and a mile wide because there's just so much more to talk about. And there are lots of books that I could refer you to learn much more about the topic. But I would really recommend, too, that you just practice doing some ethnographic research with your friends before you really dive too much deeper into the method, because there's just so much to learn intuitively through going through the process. But a few points that I would offer to you. One is, do take good descriptive field notes. And sometimes good descriptive field notes means you also need to bring in audio and video recordings. Sometimes it means that you need to have a second observer available with you. But you should be taking notes, because notes will help you to remember things, and they'll also help you to make associations in your mind about other questions that you can ask. So if you're observing how a person's behaving and you start taking notes, it might prompt you to think of some questions that you can ask them. Do rely on multiple sources of information: family, friends, coworkers, and other cohorts or social groups. When you're conducting an ethnography, don't just follow around one subject and only talk to them. Talk to other people who know them and who are around them, and try to learn more about who they are as a well-rounded 360-degree feedback kind of person, not just what they tell you about themselves or what they want to reveal about themselves. A, you'll get a lot more depth and detail that will be useful to you, but B, you'll also have a way to kind of validate that what they're telling you is not just what they perceive, but it's actually reflective of who they are. And remember, and we'll talk about this in our workshop, but there's a difference between what people say, what people do, and what people say that they do. And there's also a difference between what people say that they do and if they do what they say. So remember that and understand that other sources of information can often help you to get to the bottom of that. Do gather different sorts of data: observations, interviews, video recordings, audio recordings, photographs, etc. When you're conducting an ethnographic study, you're going to collect a lot of different types of data. And what you're going to build in the end is going to be more like a story, like a journalistic kind of profile on a person, than you are a body of research that's talking about a lot of different people. Now, your analysis down the road is going to be much more oriented around looking at common themes among your different subjects. But your initial data that you're going to collect, you're going to be putting together a story of who they are. And so however you decide to record that, make sure you get lots of different perspectives and lots of different media types that you can rely upon, because you're going to need to have a much deeper, more well-rounded understanding of who this person is than you would in any other qualitative technique. Do embed yourself within the subject's life, but draw as little attention to your presence as possible. So a good ethnographer generally tries to, hang around with, ride along with, be present in a person's life, and really tries to be as unobtrusive as possible. And the only time that they really become obtrusive is when they pop up every now and then to ask some questions. It's difficult to be unobtrusive, and you have to remember that anytime someone's being observed, they're going to be conscious of the fact that they're being observed. But as ethnography goes on, as they get more used to being observed, they will get more comfortable, and they will behave a little bit more naturally. Not completely naturally, but more naturally as they get more comfortable with the process. So remember that as well, that usually the first hour or two, they're going to be much more self-conscious than they will be later on. Look for opportunities to present data in a subject's own words. This is really important. So the whole point of ethnography is to get a good, deep, individual understanding of different research subjects. And the more you can put things in their words and their perspective, the better. So one of the things that you're going to collect a lot of is going to be great quotes. They're going to say things that you, in the context of your ethnographic research, you're going to go, wow, that was really, they put that really well. I really want to record that and use that. So always listen for how they are phrasing things, how they are saying things, and try to preserve that as much as possible. You will get a much richer presentation of your results from using their words rather than your own. Okay, a few things not to do. Don't rely solely on your written notes. And again, use multiple forms of media to collect data. You'll be happy that you have all those multiple forms. They'll help you to understand things better. Don't restrict your focus to a single subject. When you're conducting ethnographic research, the danger is that you'll get so focused on one individual that you will take their story and assume that it's projectable to others. I would highly recommend using ethnography to augment other types of research, but I would also recommend conducting multiple ethnographic studies with people who are different from each other but are in the same cohort so that you can get a well-rounded perspective. And if you've already identified personas within that cohort, or that target market, or whatever it is that you're looking at, and you can do a couple of ethnographies with each of those different personas, that will help you even more. Don't focus primarily on the words that are used by a subject. That's for interviewing. That's what interviewing is for. Look for opportunities to capture disconnects in perception and behavior. And we'll watch a video in our workshop in class about some disconnects that in an ethnographic video that I found that I think are just fascinating. But we always want to look for opportunities to say, they say they're doing this, but they're really doing that. Those are often very striking, very telling, and they reveal a lot about who we think we are versus who we really are. Don't rely on mere observation. Probe deeply and ask subjects to explain many aspects of how they go about their lives. So, again, we're not just conducting interviews. We're also not just conducting observation. When you start asking questions, get to the bottom of what it is you want to learn, and don't be afraid to put them on the spot and to make them think and work a little bit to tell you what you want to learn. Also, don't be afraid of silence. You can ask them a question, let them not have an answer for it, let them try to work it out for themselves. Remember, too, that people think as they talk, and so when you're asking them questions, when you're probing, the first answer that they give you might not be the best one. They might need a little bit of time to process and think because you're asking them something that's unfamiliar that they've never really thought about. So give them some time. Finally, don't lose sight of the objectives of your research while fielding the study. It's really easy to get pulled into the personal story of the person you're observing and to forget about what it was you were trying to learn. So if you're trying to learn about how they feel as a medical patient, don't get pulled into trying to understand their family dynamics unless those family dynamics are important. Always remember to pay close attention to what your objectives are. Be wary as well of how your own interpretation, biases, and understanding can taint ethnographic research that you conduct. It's very, very important that you be aware of all of these and that you go in with as open a mind as possible. If you feel like you're getting to a point where you cannot properly interpret the research, the best thing to do is just fall back into a mode where all you're doing is collecting data and you're shutting out and ignoring your biases and your processes, and challenge yourself as well to ask questions that you might not normally ask, to look at things that you might not normally look at, to lift up rocks and look underneath them without fear for what might be crawling underneath. Really challenge yourself in this process not to come in with your own preconceptions, because if you can divorce yourself of those and you can be a very pure logical researcher, you may find some things that you never anticipated would be there. So with that said, those are some basic ethnographic techniques. We're going to move on in our next lecture to just wrap up what we've been talking about, and then there's also a companion series to this lecture series where I have interviewed David Rich of the Research and Planning Group, and I encourage you to watch that as well.